NUBIART Diary number 435 for the 23rd of December 2020. NUBIART, a different perspective on the African world. For the December promos, we're going to look at Universal Beings, the E&F sides by Makaya McCraven, and it's out now on the International Anthem label. This is the composer, producer and polyrhythmic drummer Makaya McCraven's companion piece to the A to D sides he released in 2018. Drawing on cuts recorded at Cove Prosperity Sphere in Chicago, HO10 in New York, Jeff Parker's house in California, and London's Total Refreshment Studios. This is more than just mere outtakes. The soundscape is made up of continuous improvised performances which are digitally looped, cut, spliced and edited into entirely new tracks. Each side of the vinyl edition was subtitled for the city where it was recorded, and the tour was filmed by director Mark Palman for an accompanying documentary which takes viewers through McCraven's nomadic life and his creative process. Among the contributing artists are saxophonists Nubia Garcia, Soweto Kinch and Shabaka Hutchings, keyboardists Ashley Henry and Kamal Williams, bassist Daniel Casimir, Desron Douglas, Anna Butters and Junius Paul, violist Miguel Atwood Ferguson, harpist Brandy Younger, cellist Tomeka Reed, vibraphonist Joel Ross, guitarist Jeff Parker and percussionist Carlos Nino. Universal Beings E&F sides is a soundtrack for Palman's film, remixed by McCraven into 14 tracks of polyrhythm and melody that he has dubbed organic beat music. He uses similar techniques to those used by producer Tio Macero on the sessions for Miles Davis in the 1970s, which gave us the likes of Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way, where the musicians improvise relatively freely and then it is formed into tracks later, thus retaining the excitement and creativity of improvisation with spontaneous shouts and cheers of the band and audience capturing the excitement of a live event. Unlike the first album, the two sides are not organised according to where they were recorded. The tracks Everybody Cool, Her Name and Beat Science are centred around harp vibes and upright bass over circular syncopated beats. Isms is a duet between McCraven and Paul with Middle Eastern modal motifs. Reed's cello on Travelling Space blends seamlessly into Kings and Queens as McCraven, Hutchings and Paul establish an evolving series of beats and riffs. The bass is to the forefront on Butters Fly and Afrobeat and Juju Delicacy. Mac Attack is the single from the album. The album cover is a blown-up inset of part of Damon Locke's illustration from the first album's cover. Okay, we move on to the December media, and this is AZANISM, a critical analysis of the mytho-reality complexity of the Azanian nation by Raul Guevara Diaz. This is Diaz's 2009 PhD thesis from the University of Hamburg and is focused on two factors: the role of colonialism and the supposed heterogeneity of any society. He points out that most research has been done within the paradigm of the ethnic and national attitudes, sentiments and allegiances in the post-colonial African state, whereas his document takes a longer historical overview going back to Nile Valley civilizations and the impact of the arrival of the Hyksos in the 17th to 18th century BCE. He examines the view that foreign control of excessive influence has always brought destruction to Africa. It is also critical of the Pan-African movements whose leaders spearheaded the post-Second Imperialist World War transition from European African colonies to the post-colonial African states. The first half of AZANISM examines various Eurocentric worldviews running through the philosophy, state structures and social ties of the Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Goths, Franks, Vandals, Nordics, Aryans, Caucasians and Saxons. In the 15th to 16th century AD, this led to the rise of nation-states such as Spain, France and England, who were able to consolidate at home and use their combined resources to start to project themselves out into the wider world. They used language and religion to force the people they encountered to submit. Diaz points out that this had come out of their belief in a creator who was not benevolent, but ruthless, unforgiving, and merciless. The Europeans started to push arguments of manifest destiny, white supremacy, and the white man's burden, and the colonial expansion has become increasingly racialized over the last 5 centuries. Race thinking has now penetrated all scientific disciplines, and even the word science or scientific, when used by Europeans, is their code for their own self-promotion. Europeans could encounter societies, nations, and peoples far more advanced than them in agriculture, metallurgy, cosmology, and ethics, and still refer to them as backward peoples or as having made no contribution to civilization while plundering their material wealth. For Arendt, racism was an ideological tool employed by all European imperialists, and that's on page 124 of the thesis. To this day, the museums and private collections of Europeans are stuffed with the cultural, spiritual, agriculture, and familial belongings of people who had no say in their dispossession or how their plundered treasures are displayed and catalogued. Different actual, fictional, or fanciful strands fed into the Europeans' notion of the nation-state. These include common descent, territorial belonging, shared language, ethnic history, and emotional bonds through nationalist language and symbols. The ethnic and civil components of nationness relied heavily on calls to blood and land. French nationhood was based on citizenship, while the Germans focused on Volk, people, and traditions. Yet many languages, folk tales, and folk culture they encountered in other countries were swept away by colonization and so-called modernization. These cultural differences even manifested among themselves as Anglo-Saxons, Danes, and Normans invaded and merged in Britain, but had disputes with the Scots and Celts who were already there. Popes and the likes of Charlemagne promoted themselves into ancestral myth in order to expand their territory. The use of sacred languages and scripts aided state expansion. People across the world supported Hitler's Third Reich as they could see how to use it to further their own territorial claims and wealth accumulation. Hitler used other European countries' colonial possessions as an argument for German expansion. It was the fact he overran European countries that those nations opposed. The Israeli nation-state could have been in Uganda or Argentina, and Hitler had planned to deport the Yehudi to Madagascar, so we see that their claims to primacy on indigenous Palestinian land are paper-thin. There were 3 elements of the modern nation-state: industrialization, central bureaucracy and legal remit, literacy, and linguistic homogenization. Clerics were the elites in agrarian states, but they have been replaced by clerks as societies modernized, switched from a focus on agriculture, and became more secular. There was also the adoption of the linear concept of development. Something that we have always been suspect of is the core European belief that they must create or follow every idea they can think of, without consideration for whether it is beneficial, sustainable, or even necessary. Hence, we have money and resources diverted to nuclear arms and vanity projects, while there is ongoing pollution, starvation, and inequality in the world. The French and US constitutions are considered as the working models for many nation-states, even though equality was not practiced or welcomed in those states, which carried out wholesale genocide and widespread enslavement. Thus, African states in colonial times were based on instability, intrastate conflicts, violent subjugation, political crises, serving the colonizer in exports, labour, resource allocation, and taxation. Diaz sees the push for secession by the likes of Eritrea and Somaliland in the last 3 decades as based more on reactions to the colonial construct and not the ethnicity of the inhabitants. He counterposes the false beneficiaries with what he terms AZANISM and writes on page 3, Azania is used here to represent an ethno-cultural national community of the Bantu Ethiopians prior to colonial African politics. The African continent, especially in the Upper Nile Valley around the Great Lakes and the Mountains of the Moon, being the home of mankind, has a longer cosmological history which feeds into the earthly agricultural and environmental harmony. On page 32, Diaz writes, religion in general tunes actions to an envisaged cosmic order and projects images of cosmic order onto the plane of human existence. Diaz explores some of the original indigenous cosmologies. The Dinka believed that the original man existed on 1 grain of millet a day. There was no death and man climbed a rope ladder to the sky. Women who were in charge of agriculture planted more millet than was needed for sustenance. During the planting, the Creator was struck with a hoe. Angered, he left man to labor for food and endure sickness and death. Other widespread mythic symbols are corn, cows, and crocodile. Rams feature in mythologies across the African continent, driving home Diaz's argument of an Azanian cultural unity. The Mandinka god of storm, water, and thunder, fire, takes earthly shape as a ram. Among the Yoruba, Shango has a ram's mask. The Baul of Ivory Coast represent Nyani, the sky, with a ram mask. The fawn god of lightning was a ram. Ethiopian Egyptian history is currently controlled by biased experts with personal, economic and political agendas. Pharaonic Egypt has been contested ground between African, Azanian heritage and the historians, anthropologists, philologists and Egyptologists who put Egypt in with the Semitic nations of East and North Africa and Asia. Egypto-Semitic languages of Arabia, Syria and Mesopotamia were linked to Ethiopian dialects of the Basharis, Galas and Somalis. Semites migrated to these African regions and thus they claim they belong to the same race. Greeks claimed Egypt was Western, ignoring Egyptian claims of being indigenous. Kemet means the black country. Some claim it was the soil that was black, others it was the colour of the inhabitants. Some so-called scholars prefer to use the term Abyssinians rather than Ethiopians to avoid discussions of the blackness linked to the word Ethiopia. Baron Cuvier said Ethiopians were Negroes, but Abyssinians were Arabians, hence Caucasians. Webster New English Dictionary described Ethiopians as mythical people. Greeks considered them dark-skinned. Actual Ethiopians were considered to speak Semitic languages. Flinders Petrie linked ancient Egypt to the Caucasus. The Greek writers Homer and Hesiod were treated not as poets, but encyclopedias, and anything not mentioned by them was considered to not have existed. Richard Lepsius went to Egypt in 1842. His 12-volume Monuments of Egypt and Nubia is core to Egyptology. He removed 15,000 objects which became the nucleus of the Berlin Museum. Here, Adolf Ehrman wrote his Life in Ancient Egypt. Most Egyptological chronologies now disagree with Manetho on dynasties of Egypt, Nubia, Meroe, Ethiopia, Punt, and Lebu Libya. Manetho's works were used by Flavius Josephus, Julius Africanus, and Eusebius. Yet Herodotus speaks of 400 pharaonic dynasties, meaning Egyptian history was 8 to 10,000 years old before Abraham showed up. Bantu Ethiopians developed concepts such as matriarchy, totemism, and monotheistic religion after developing sedentary agriculture, and the Alexandria Library had 400,000 rolls of papyrus. Ammon is the original uncreated creator of all and is considered to be androgynous. Europeans in harsh conditions could not believe in a beneficent creator and relied on themselves. Their deities were cruel and merciless, such as Zeus, Marduk, and Yahweh. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity invoked the principle of swallowing the weaker one's blood by co-opting the religion to serve the Roman Empire. The cannibal hymn is a ritual to ensure the king's transition from mortal to immortal state of God, and then as a ruler in the celestial province where divinity holds sway. The dead king overcomes the power that killed him through resurrection, becoming the bull of the sky. To sever a bull's head means to kill him utterly. Restoration of the head was complete restoration of life. The head, foreleg, and heart are the main ritual offerings. Compare this to other reports of resurrection and the ritual of the opening of the mouth. Note swallows the sun at night, and it is reborn in the morning. In the Nile Valley, the replacement of the red crown with a green crown could indicate the Bantu Ethiopian Hoi Aegyptoi culture ideal of the green Ammon or the Memphitic sacred bull Apis or Minervis of Heliopolis. Ammon was green due to the seeds from the Greek tree of life. The Ashantis were classified as pygmies of the Niger. Their capital, Kumasi, means the tree of life. Indigenous Indians of the Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro civilizations also shared the Bantu Ethiopian culture of the solar deity and the Apis bull. Bantu Ethiopians, AZANIANs, identified terrestrial lives with celestial bodies and stars. There were monolithic cultural institutions along the Nile Valley with a source at the island of the Double Cave and the Mountain of the Moon, where ancestral spirits and the matriarchal Nile goddess Hapi are located. The Great Lakes, the source of the Nile, Victoria and Nyanza, were the site of the origins of the Egyptian ritual of resurrection. The god serpent specializes in dancing in the dark and is called the one who dances in the shadows. The inscription was found on a sarcophagus accompanying Osiris's tomb. In the Dogon pantheon, the seventh ancestor transformed into a serpent. He was killed by his own men and his head buried beneath the blacksmith's cushion. The ancestor serpent dances underground. The jackal god of the Dogons is linked to the Egyptian jackal-headed god, guardian of the pond where the dead are cleansed. The Dogons still use footsteps of the jackal wolf, which travels at night, to determine the cause of death. Diaz sees many of the cosmological, economic, and philosophical aspects of Christianity and Islam as incompatible with the African worldview. He mentions Modibo Diakité, a Dogon traditionalist who speaks of a time when the Sahara was green, before Islam and camels. The rivers were filled with crocodiles and hippopotamus. Diakité blames the arrival of Allah for draining the primordial water. Pharaohs did not include camels in the list of sacred animals of the indigenous culture. This, along with the ongoing rape of African women by Arab nomads, make it impossible to find a national consensus in many of the countries where Islam is not indigenous. While some Africans have adopted a less doctrinaire, Sufi form of Islam, extremist sects such as Salafism and Wahhabism, with their forced conversions, scorched earth policies, reorienting of the African gaze from the source of the Nile in Central Africa to Mecca, and a general belief in Arab supremacy, mean that African Arab borderlands will always be a source of conflict and contestation. Globalization makes democracy and calls for equal treatment of nationals irrelevant. In Kenichi's words, a firm in an economic region can source its capital in London, locate its industrial plant in China, tap information from the database in Singapore, and hire individuals in India or Germany to design factory layouts. The slave trade is one of the first instances of a global trade. The horrors in the Belgian Congo, Namibia, and German East Africa, etc., were examples of global commerce at its most rampant. Current political crises in Chad, Somalia, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, etc., are examples of the failure of nation-states and the threat to indigenous populations by Europeans, Arabs, and so on. Africa has found itself at the mercy of foreign technologies and ideologies even in modern times. Kofi Annan praised India's Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s without taking account of the environmental problems such as water and agricultural land shortages. In 2020, India has been dominated by protests by farmers who are concerned about being drawn into systems which leave them impoverished and landless. Annan urged African farmers to get access to good seed, fertilizers and financing by partnering with the US Millennium Challenge Corporation. However, the US and Britain have been active in Kenya without any benefit to the population since independence. Most of Kenya's agricultural sector supplies the export market, e.g. corn, rice, soya and wheat are often used as biofuel, making food too expensive. Fertilizers used in Kenya are banned in the West. Lakes Chad and Victoria are under threat from these farming methods, whereas Maatian legal text shows that destruction of forests was among the most serious of cultural crimes. Despite the rise of concrete use, round thatch-roofed buildings are still more in line with sustainability goals. Part of Diaz's critique of Pan-Africanism is that it operates on colonial-imposed rootless African nations that are more a product of the Berlin Conference than indigenous cultural identification. European pseudo-nationalist policies, especially in the Americas, fed into the national consciousness awakening of AZANIAN Ethiopian Americans that would lead to the formation of the Pan-African movement. Diaz urges AZANIAN Americans not to claim parts of other people's land as their own homeland, as Azania is their natural habitat and homeland. The issue of holding the fifth pack in Liberia had been discussed at the time, but it was eventually held in the diaspora again in the northern British city of Manchester. The earlier PAC London conference had resolutions on land, capital, labour, education and the state. Diaz questions whether the political aspects are in reality more important than the cultural aspects of Pan-Africanism. This moves him on to a critique of Kwame Nkrumah's accommodation of Arab hegemony in Africa and his spousal choice. Akhenaten's mother, Queen Tai, was not a true solar princess and probably only partly Egyptian. Amenhotep III linked himself to the royal houses of Asia and he had several Asiatic subwives. His own mother had been the daughter of the Asiatic king of Mitanni, the Aram, Naharam of the Old Testament. Amenhotep's fourth wife was also Asiatic. Queen Tai ruled when Amenhotep was too sick and tired and was the first queen to have her name on official acts. Queen Tai's father Yuga was a Hurrian high official and priest. Both her and her mother Tua's bodies have been found and identified. There is a lack of African blocks of states, e.g. a Black African or Black World League, where matters can be discussed without Arabs. Pan-Africanism has failed to establish this and thus is seen as weak and without an appeal to ordinary Africans. Diaz also expresses opposition to Nkrumah's socialist agenda, pointing out that Karl Marx had supported the colonization of so-called backward peoples and slaves in the interests of so-called economic progress. Many of the African continent's main anti-colonial figures moved within socialist circles, were trained or educated within the socialist bloc, or in the case of Julius Nyerere, developed their own concepts of scientific socialism. Africa was set up to be a supplier of raw materials to its colonial metropolitan centres and so was short of technical expertise. For the last 2 centuries, financial, technical, ecological and agricultural techniques have been increasingly at the mercy of external experts and their cultural and political imperatives. e.g. the role of the Chinese in Africa and inexperienced non-Africans getting to train in Africa. Ethiopia acknowledged the right of secession after the defeat of the Derg in 1991. This led to the formal independence of Eritrea in 1993. It was also the underpinning of the Ethiopian nation-state, which was dominated by the Tigrayans and the remnants of the Amharic political, economic and military class that had survived since the removal of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie in 1974. When the Oromo Muslim Christian Abiy Ahmed took over power in 2018, this was due to the Oromo being the largest tribe or nation in the country, but they had always been marginalized as many of them were Muslim, even though the national capital, Addis Ababa, was built on their historic lands. Recent disputes have been due to the city's expansion into surrounding lands, while the Tigrayans are upset that the power base they had established over 3 decades was pushed to acknowledge political and economic claims from other parts of the nation-state. Ethnic groups share a belief in common ancestry and homeland based on population and territory distinguished from tribes and clans. Diaz sees many of the current ethnic groups as cover for armed criminal groups based on external economic and political agents. Pseudo-ethnism is used only to get concessions from national or central governments. Tribal or pseudo-ethnic challenges emerge out of the tyrannical nature of the nation-state and can be seen in events such as the Kenyan election riots in 2007, which saw the nation divided ethnically, especially between the Kikuyu and Luo. The Rwandan genocide, divisions between Kimbundus and Mbundus in Angola, Ndebele and Shona in Zimbabwe. The ANC power struggle in 2008 between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma was characterized as being between Xhosas and Zulus. South Africans now are fighting other Africans who have migrated there. Nigeria has its Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba setup. Igbos claim they are superior to other Nigerians as the oil is in their area. Igbos want to dominate other tribes in eastern Nigeria and the Delta when Biafra comes about. The Ashantis claim similar primacy due to their gold reserves, but they act in consort with colonialism, e.g. Anglo-Ashanti gold. All this reveals the commitment of many African political leaders to the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference carve-up. The weakness of economic models is shown by their inability to solve national problems. Even powerhouses such as Germany have issues, so what chance do weak African governments and their Pan-African intelligentsia have to succeed? Thus, Diaz concludes that the primary goal of all Azanian nationalists must be to liberate the continent from all forms of foreign colonization. In the first instance, this must include a reversion to the primacy of the indigenous Bantu Ethiopians' cultural practices with an appeal to the pan-deity of the Bantu Ethiopian pantheon, Men. The resuscitation of the Theban culture school must be accompanied by the total liberation of the Great Nile Valley region, which is the sacred land of the indigenous Bantu Ethiopians' national culture system, from the pending Arab colonial occupation. However, this is neither the aims of much of the current African tribal irredentism, nor is it the shared political objective of the leaders and intellectuals of the Pan-African movement, who in their coerced servitude to the colonial African heritage, the 54 continental states, have hitherto sought a state-centric approach to African unity in spite of the obvious pseudo-nationalistic implications. Diaz ends by saying that life is not a paradox, but an eternal reality. This is a fascinating exploration of how culture and cosmologies are developed to suit society's needs, but not every worldview is in the interests of the earth and its inhabitants. The first half of this dissertation involves getting to grips with some deep European philosophical dialectics that are often limited or contradictory to themselves, but it is worth staying with it to see how Diaz sets out his arguments and raises many salient points that need to be addressed in order for Africa AZANIA to regain its place in the economic, political and social affairs of humanity and restore the world's balance. Okay, let's move on to lyrics and spirits. O ye gods of the underworld, who set yourself up against me, and who resist the mighty ones, the stars which never set have led me on my way. And that's from chapter 78 from the Papyrus of Ani. And what I'm going to read is the poem which closed our poetry collection of Slaughter and Consumption, which was published 3 decades ago, and is appropriate for ending 2020. We still have a few more offerings from the book to publish in the coming year, but for this time, all we can suggest is that people burn some cleansing Palo Santo, sage or frankincense and keep your dreams close to your heart. This is called Closer Still. The world is my oyster, distance is no problem. Thoughtfulness coming over me, reflecting on all that has been said and done. What have I to learn? Could it have been any different? Will it be any different in the future? Daydreaming of the future, realizing it falls short of paradise right down the line. Planning? We make plans and we fall into plans. Our plans are only the foundation of the great plan. Little by little, specks become visible when someone speaks and you say, seeing. Reality? Life don't wait. It's buzzing around, opportunities flirting in and out. It's not about lack of opportunities, but recognizing an opportunity when it comes up and being in a good position to take advantage of it. The life business will never be set. That's why it's called runnings. Not because they're always running in your favor, but because they're continuous, ongoing, requiring effort and patience to make them work fully for you. People start to fan out. I can see through the trees. One look should be enough. No more saying, I knew it all along. But caution for surety still. Seeing who, what, and where I don't want to be. A time to step up to show myself in full glory, to be myself and to be recognized for that, to speak out my living knowledge and show my understanding. And that was written in August 1990 and published in my book of Slaughter and Consumption. And that brings us to the end of this edition of the NUBIART Diary. If you want to get in touch with us, is Kubara Zamani, African Quest, P.O. Box 35165, London SE5 8WU. Email africanquest1@hotmail.com and on Twitter @NUBIART Diary. And we'll just close with our saying, talk sense or it don't make sense you talk. Thanks for listening. Guidance.